I think moving swiftly on. Welcome, Tim. Thank you very much for coming. It's very good to have you here today. I know you have a lot of great experience that hopefully you can share some of which with us tonight. So Tim is from Abingworth. I think a lot of you here tonight will probably know who he is, but has a lot of experience working both as in the sort of CEO level of various healthcare companies and also obviously as a VC investor. So you worked as a CEO in senior management at several healthcare companies before you started at Abingworth. So I just wondered, I noticed you sort of moved on every sort of 3 or 4 years, well, it looked like. So I wondered what the reasoning behind that was, and whether you weren't happy with the work, or whether you wanted to move on to something else. Or
That's an interesting place to start. First of all, good evening, everybody. You realised that you were missing an incredible debate going on, and the misfortunes and disasters that are happening to our Prime Minister. Disraeli talked about his nemesis Gladstone, and he described the difference between misfortune and disaster. So if Gladstone fell into the Thames, that would be a misfortune. If somebody went to rescue him, that would be an absolute disaster. So with that as an introduction, I think interestingly enough, so I'm a dismal scientist in economics. I then did an MBA. I then worked for a company called Baxter. I went to the US. I think it was 27, and through various events, got to be a CEO of a startup, actually an orthopedic startup, which we sold to J&J. I then joined another company in the US, which we also sold. So actually, a number of the events have been sales. We lived in the US for about 14 years, spent some time in France as well, part of the kids in the UK, came back to the UK and then started up Aztecs in 2000. So I was fascinated to hear Ryan's story. So I was essentially the founding CEO of a company called Aztecs. There were 4 people in the company, 2 were ex-GSK, very clever people, thankfully for me, and a guy called Professor Tom Blundell, who was the professor of biochemistry at Cambridge. There were 3 full-time employees, Ryan. We had a little office in a realtor in Cambridge. The human genome had just been discovered. The biotech world then, a bit like today, was going mad. So we raised £28 million on a £20 million pre-money valuation with 3 people in the company, no labs. Right? It was literally a twinkle in a professor's eye, based around solving 3-dimensional crystal structures and building small molecules based on a very small structural elements. So we thought we were heroic, and in some respects it was brilliant. But then, as always, you have to pay the piper, and the whole markets then crashed. It was like a nuclear winter for many, many years. And part of the problem we had was we had raised a lot of money at a high valuation. You then had to go out to with a number of VC investors, of which Abingworth was one, and all the VCs, damn them, wanted to do was there's no way they wanted the valuation to come down. So it was a pretty interesting time. We actually went to Berlin. We merged with a company called Metagen, who happened to have 30 million euros on their balance sheet. The Apax had funded them. It wasn't working. So that was how we got cash, and we got to move down the road. So I think I empathise hugely with Ryan's slightly different journey, but I would say I had hair before I'd started being a CEO, but that's absolutely not true, I'm afraid. So a lot of those things, and then we eventually sold Aztecs to Otsuka Pharmaceuticals. I'm delighted it's still doing fantastically well up in Cambridge, and just had our first drug approved this year, which is for metastatic breast cancer, which is brilliant. And then I was asked by Abingworth, who was the main investor, if I wanted to cross over to the dark side.
I was going to say, what was your motivation in doing that? I mean, what attracted you to becoming
an investor? I never thought about it. So I'd always been an operating guy, just like Ryan, and trials and tribulations. You've got to be a little bit odd to want to run any company, particularly a biotech company. And I was actually on my way to be CEO of a FTSE 250 company when Abingworth tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Have you ever thought about being a venture capitalist?" And I thought about it for a bit, and I thought, goodness, this is pretty exciting. The science is fantastic. And the people I enjoyed, the people I knew, the people pretty well. So I joined them as a partner. and most of it's turned out to be great. I mean, the things we've been involved in, we're hugely privileged just by being in the healthcare industry, I would say, but to be really at the cutting edge of, we invested in Selecta, which was the first mapping of DNA, at least high throughputly. We invested in Series A of CRISPR 4 years ago. So some of these journeys are truly remarkable. It's very different, however, being a CEO than being in the venture world. The venture world, as a CEO, while you take all the responsibility, you have most of the decisions, so you can actually get on and do stuff.
Yeah.
If you wake up, you have to think about something in the bath, you can wake up and people will actually listen to you for the most part. Very different the US, UK, just as a very quick aside. In the US, whatever title you have gives you instant credibility, right? So if you're the VP of something, you must be very important, very smart. In the UK, completely the reverse, right?
Yeah.
You're CEO. Show me what are you good at? What makes you so smart? So it's a very interesting dynamic. It's very healthy, I would add. It may explain why Donald Trump still gets. We won't go there.
So I suppose you have to do a lot of people management almost if you've got a lot of very strong personalities that are coming in seeking investment.
Yeah, very much so. And I think as an industry, biotech is a very long-term industry. So, there's a fair amount of arrogance and, strong personalities. There's a lot of academics who, of course, are all geniuses and could all run these companies. They do this. Actually, some of them figure out it's actually a little bit different. I'm sure it's Ryan's experience as well.
I mean, how do you go about? I mean, that's an interesting point because actually, if somebody comes in and they are acting that way, I mean, how do you go about challenging them and seeing if that is really a worthwhile investment?
Yeah, we match them with even more arrogant people in Abingworth. So that's no. Look, I think actually the people with experience are pretty humble because, and again, as Ryan said, most of the experiments don't work out. What I would say is we've been around 45 years, so we've done the first rounds of Gilead and all kinds of stuff. We've done 150 investments over that time. Less than 10% have gone into bankruptcy. So it's a very, very low failure rate. And the real trick to that, obviously, the intellectual property is very important. We tend to invest in platform companies that then generate products. But and this is going to sound cliche, but if you get the right management, and many of our successes have started off in one place, including Gilead, which was kind of an RNAi company. If you've got the right management, they'll take you off in a different direction. So actually, compared to many other industries, our companies they won't all be fantastic multiples, but most of them will get to the end of the journey.
You mentioned RNAi. I know they recently the first RNAi drug was being approved in by Alnylam's one.
We were the major owner. We were the major investor in Alnylam. Interestingly, through Germany, which had some IP. That's how we got into Alnylam.
Why do you think it took so long?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you actually look at the industry, most technologies will go through cycles. There's the hype. There's then, unfortunately, be it gene therapy, as we talked about already. CRISPR will probably go through some of that. Most of the major medical advances, there's super hype. Then there's the reality. Often it's about off-target effects. It's choosing the right indications, which is the biggest challenge in biotechnology, I would modestly suggest. And often people with novel technologies will go after less exciting indications, and that's not always the right thing to do. I think we are, we're in it's a brave new world in biology. I think, the pundits are saying in the next 10 years we'll discover more than we've ever discovered in biology. And it feels like that. I think we are, but I think you've got to take more and more risk in terms of what you're doing and how you're developing things. So I think, Alnylam, but if you look at many other companies with a similar background, they tend to go through this shape. Unfortunately, we are 10-year funds. You can actually go 2 or 3 more years, but we take money, we invest in the first 5 years. We've then got to repay our investors back, and ideally with something else. But unfortunately, most of biotech, it's the next 10 or 15 years are the really successful ones. We did the A round of Gilead. If we kept it until last year, I think we'd have made 1,000 times our money, of course. Really? But that's over a much longer time period. But,
So, I mean, CAR T, obviously, that's a big area as well. So you mentioned CRISPR as well. So I think you were the only, I'm right in saying you were the only European VC that actually invested in the sort of CRISPR therapeutic side of business.
That's probably
That's
right. Yeah,
yeah,
that may well be right. I need to think about that. We looked at all three of the key companies. We were kind of predisposed, having been involved in Celexa, and we certainly felt it would be an exciting tool. I think we've all been surprised by how quickly it has moved. We invested 4 years ago in the A round. Again, there were 3 people in the company then. We helped move it to the US, and that's another story. It's very much a platform company. We kind of saw that. It could have been bought by somebody, as Kite and Juno have, as a kind of platform business. But I think we took the view better off in the US, and indeed we took it public. It's now about $2 billion, so it's moved very, very quickly. As interestingly is the ability to raise non-dilutive capital. So they've raised over $200 million through doing partnerships with pharmaceutical companies. And I think that's, if you characterize where biotech is today, one of the fundamental shifts is the appetite for the pharmaceutical industry to externalize, and the need and the reliance they now have on the biotech industry. Been a huge change. If you go back 20 years ago, less than 10% of the products in pharma's pipeline came from biotech or came from externally. Today it's over 65%. So if you look at any industries, 9 of the top 10 selling drugs are from biotech. This year is a record year in FDA approvals, over 55 drugs, over 60% are from the biotech industry. So we have come of age, and we are now an incredible powerhouse broadly as an industry. That doesn't mean it's easy, but nonetheless, I think the appetite for the pharma industry has taken away some of the early refinancing risk in building companies. It allows us to go a lot earlier and take a lot more risk in the things we invest in, because we've got quite a high chance that the pharmaceutical industry will buy, will do some interesting deals, will fund us. So I think that's certainly, if you look back 10, 15 years ago, been a huge change.
Well, I noticed, we've been noticing recently some of, I know gentlemen in the audience mentioned the Moderna IPO, and I think although it was very large, I understand it wasn't quite as large as they were hoping for, and their valuation's not as high as they were hoping for. I wonder, sometimes the actual, and there's been a few European companies that have, at the last minute, stopped doing, not done their IPOs when they said they were going to recently. So I wondered if you could comment on that at all.
Yeah, it'll be a record year for IPOs in the US, probably 60-ish will end up. So it's been incredible, and the windows have been open for quite a while. And if you look at the valuations, they've absolutely grown dramatically. So I think there's been, a little bit of exuberance in the public markets in the US. And so I think we're now inevitably coming into a more volatile period. I think it is inevitable. And some of the public valuations have been impacting the valuations privately as well. We've got pretty nervous about some of the deals. This year there have been 12 Series A, that's the first round essentially, that have raised more than $100 million. That's huge amounts of money. And many of the valuations, the median valuation in the US has effectively doubled for Series A valuations in the last year. So it's a pretty hot market. I think some of it is justified, but I think it's not clear. So I think Moderna, they may not have got what they wanted, but goodness, it's incredible valuation, and they've raised a lot of capital.
Yeah, interesting. So why do you think that is? Why has it gone up so much?
Yeah, I think it is about, part of it is about the farmers' willingness to pay. I think, earlier this year, Juno and Kite were both bought for significant multiples, $9 and $12 billion, relatively young companies. I think it is the coming of age of the biotech industry. I think people are now believing that biotech can not only come up with good ideas, they can deliver products. The Gilead Pharmaset story, for those of you familiar with that, a startup company, we're involved on the periphery of that, but they were a public company. Gilead bought them for $9 billion. People said, what on earth is Gilead paying $9 billion for them? But of course, the cure for HCV, it added about $140 billion within 3 years to Gilead's market cap. So I think that's one of the elements, the realization that biotech not only can come up with good ideas, but can take the products all the way through. A lot of the innovations that you're seeing are new modalities. many of them, the biotech is actually well positioned to develop. And I think fundamentally we are in an exponential part of some of these discoveries. CRISPR will become an absolutely game-changing technology in all kinds of ways. And I think that potential is starting to be appreciated. If you ask me, what will the public markets look like in a year's time, that remains to be seen. And I think if they do come off, some of these valuations will come back. There is a huge risk appetite there's a lot of cash in the US, so we shouldn't ignore the macro environment. Where else is money going to go when treasury bonds aren't returning anything? So that's a piece of it too, I think. And there's a risk appetite, so there is a bit of a bubble, less so in Europe, and that's another story.
I was going to say, what do you think of the European side of things? Because obviously, I mean, from what I can see, it seems that in general, it's a lot more caution in Europe, and people don't seem to be going quite so big. I mean, I don't know. Do you think that's changing? Or?
I think the earlier stage is not bad. I think we've seen the amounts of money going in. There's still probably, if you look on a Series A like for like with the US, are probably half the absolute amount of dollars going in per deal. But I think there's more than enough to build the early stage science. I think that piece is actually pretty good. I think the UK, probably 30% of venture dollars in life sciences comes to the UK. So I think we really do punch above our weight on all kind of metrics. The biggest challenge is really the public markets piece, to build these successful companies, the CRISPRs, the Alnylams, the Autolyses of this world. You really do need to access US money, and there is not the basic risk appetite from the retailers, from pension funds across Europe. We don't have a single market either. So that we tend to think if we're considering our companies are going to be IPO, we will, particularly if they need large amounts of capital, we will look to the US markets and if necessary move them across there, which is why we're one of the few companies with a real footprint in both markets, and it serves us really, really well. So that's probably the biggest challenge. We've also not had many huge successes, unfortunately, in terms of public biotech companies, and that's a bit of a weakness for us. And the ones that have not worked out, the problem with the Europeans, we have long memories. The US investors tend to have pretty short memories, but we unfortunately remember the things that didn't quite work out.
I was having some interesting discussions at Bio-Europe earlier this year about how the Chinese are now getting very interested in investing, going the other way, so investing in Europe since their regulations have changed for the government. So you can now bring a drug to market with very little China data. I believe you have to show that it doesn't have an ethnic basis, but you can actually do that, and I think that's an interesting point. So it's now opened up, so if you have a drug that's been approved in Europe, you can actually potentially get it onto the Chinese market, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that. So is that something that's going to become a lot bigger, do you think? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I actually came back from China last week, so I've got a little bit of live data, and certainly the ability to get approvals for drugs in China is improving. Japan, likewise, there's an increasing commonality of data. I think China as a market opportunity is really very, very interesting, and many of our portfolio companies are doing deals with Chinese companies really for access to products. Less interest in, I think they're not yet at a point where the early stage science is quite as established as the Western science, and there's lots of things that I think you need, ingredients for success. We talked about Boston. I lived in Boston nearly 30 years ago, and there was Wang Computers, Route 128, and I think Josh Bowe at Vertex had just thought about forming a company. It's changed out of all recognition. Cambridge, UK, I think Oxford's starting to catch up. But you need certain ingredients to be successful. Good universities, I think things like medicinal chemistry, there's an awful lot of green fingers, good hospitals, and then there's kind of a concentration, particularly of companies that builds this. And I think the Chinese don't quite have it, I think. Okay. And again, if you look at the industry, it's quite a clustered industry. It's not, US and Europe, it's Boston, the Bay, Silicon Valley, it's Cambridge, Oxford, some other geographies across Europe, but pretty focused. So I think they will get there on the early stuff. A huge amount of capital. How that comes to bear will be interesting. And going into China, I think, remains a challenge. So while I think Donald Trump's doing some pretty crazy things at many levels, I think he does have a point that the Chinese can come and acquire any business in any part of the world. You try acquiring a business or setting up a standalone entity in China, very, very hard. So I think it is a bit asymmetric, but I think it's that will evolve, and as a market opportunity is huge, and the amount of capital there is astonishing, actually.
So I wanted to ask you, because you've worked in this area for quite a long time now, and you've got a really good overview of the biotech industry. So what do you think are the really hot things that are coming up right now? I mean, the really new stuff that's coming up, just sort of, end of 2018, beginning of 2019.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably focus on 3 areas that I think are really exciting. I think they're bubbling under now. I think there's lots of other things coming down the road. I do think the whole CRISPR genomic cell manipulation piece is incredible. I think some of the data we're starting to see is really fascinating. I think moving towards treatment of solid tumours, allogeneic therapies. I think the ability to really refine cells. There's some of the reprogramming things that we're seeing coming out of Japan is fascinating. So the ability to use CRISPR, the ability to use gene therapy, and to kind of reprogram cells. I think the whole synthetic biology more broadly, I think, is huge, and we're right in the midst of that. And in some respects, in the early days, it's exploded. Who the winners are going to be, I don't know, but I think we're all confident that it will be successful. Some of the tools that companies like Ryan are doing, it's the refinements that are probably going to make the difference here. I think immuno-oncology we talked about, I think that is huge, the ability to use the body's immune system. I think, again, we're still at the early days. Allogeneic I think is important. I think that will continue to grow dramatically. And if you just look at the whole the incidence of cancer, Asian populations, etc., I think those are very important. So I think we're living those today. I think the third piece, interestingly enough, kind of embraces where some of those things come together, and including the economics. I think that it's around the personalization and the targeting of drugs to patients that are going to respond. And I think things like human genomes, we obviously now understand human genomes. There'll be every baby will have their genome analysed in the next few years for sure. But the ability, for example, to look at the genome of the tumour and to be able to track that, and I think we're at the early stages of being able to do it through a blood test, pick up the debris from the tumour, so you can see if the patient's responding to therapy. Eventually it will move into the screening and the wellness space. Should the treatment change, because you're seeing the change in the mutation of the oncology. So I think all of that is incredibly valuable, both in terms of early intervention, the whole kind of wellness space, but also I think, and to the point that was covered briefly earlier, I think we will be in a pay-for-performance environment in 10, 15 years. And I think the good news for the industry is we'll have much greater confidence because we will be able to target the drugs to the people who will be responders. And I think all that convergence of, and AI is a piece of that, but diagnostics have been around for a while, but I think we're now at a point where that's coming together and will be incredibly positive. So those are probably my three key areas, I think, that are exciting.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect opportunity to open up to the audience. So, gentleman over here.
Tim, you were talking earlier about the increasing valuations of companies and the increasing Series A's and B's. If you think about the logical exit as like an acquisition, you take the multiples that VCs demand from the buyer, like myself. What do you see for role in the ever-growing call for lower drug prices that the VCs can take as well, by maybe taking less higher valuations or less multiples or anything like that? Do you see there any role for
philanthropic venture capital? Very interesting concept. No, look, I think it's a good point. Interestingly enough, as the valuations in the IPOs have gone up, if you track the M&As the last 5 years, they've actually gone down. So while pharma has a huge amount of capital, arguably about $1 trillion on their balance sheet, they are very reticent to overpay, and you can absolutely see that in the data. I think for the most part, while companies that we look to build, we're either going to sell them or float them. We tend not to get involved in commercialization of the ultimate drugs. But goodness, we spend a lot of time thinking about the pricing aspects of them, particularly for things like gene therapy. We're in, for example, in a company in Paris who's just it's treating blindness in one eye called Labiotech's hereditary optical neuropathy with gene therapy. These are late teenagers. They go blind in one eye, they then go blind in the other. The data looks really encouraging. We hope we don't have to it's unlikely we'll have to commercialize it because somebody, an Alexion or somebody will come to buy it. But we spend a lot of time looking at the pricing, what is reasonable to price, so that when we engage with pharma, we can understand the pharmacoeconomics of that. It is really hard, right? Because you've got to try and assess the qualitative impact as well as the quantitative one of saving somebody's sight. The good news is they're a relatively small population, so a lot of what we're doing in the orphan diseases, while the individual numbers are quite high, and some of them have to be. You heard the cost of just making the blooming things is $1 million or whatever in some of these drugs. So I think that's kind of in many cases we're doing that. I think the only response is the response I had earlier, is that we know when we're investing in companies and ideas is that we better think through who's going to pay for these things. And I do think this improving the outcomes is really where we've got to focus. There was a famous GSK executive, I won't name him, who a few years ago said that 50% of drugs simply don't work, and they're given to the wrong patients. And actually, it's probably true even today. So I think that's probably where the answer is. I think as an industry, this is not an easy industry, and we rely on getting being paid appropriately for what we do. And I think it's hard to imagine the venture capital industry being able to do a deal with pharma or even the payers to see those margins come down. It's I think the economics, some people may judge them as outrageous, but I think we work pretty hard, and I think bring good drugs to market, and I think the returns are probably okay, actually.
Do you think the answer might be what Ryan was saying earlier, that if he can get what he's doing to work, that will help to bring the price down?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. I think as you move forward, and I think things like autologous therapies, CAR T. I mean, there's been a couple of drugs approved. Goodness, the challenges of taking out the cells, growing the cells, refining them, getting back into the patients. If you can have an allogeneic solution sitting on the shelf, the economic savings of that are huge. And I think that comes through natural market forces, to be honest with you, as these industries start to mature. And you've seen it in the pharma industry. The pharma industry is growing probably 2 to 3% top line. If you went back 15 years ago, it was probably 10 to 15%. Biotech is growing much faster on the top line. So I think there are some natural forces. I have, if you want to have a discussion about how the heck does the US afford to spend 1/5 of its GDP on healthcare when you've got 65% of healthcare dollars are spent on people over 65, and I think, just to bore you with another statistic, the population is going to grow by nearly 1 billion in the next 15 years. Of that billion increase, more than a third is in that 65 years and older. So the pressures on funding of healthcare are huge, and some of them, I think there will be rationing for sure, some variety. There will be pay for performance, and I think a lot of it will be pushing back into the wellness side, and again, the whole technology thing. Some of the things Verily's doing, part of Google, are really fascinating. I won't bore you with this, but congestive heart failure is the biggest user of inpatient beds across the world, right? Most of these patients, if they took their drugs at the right time to control their hypertension, they wouldn't need to go to the hospital. So there are some things, and Verily's working on a whole census basis, putting it in old people's homes so they can use all this data to figure out when they're at risk and to remind them to take their drugs. So I think there are some significant spends that actually technology will have quite a significant impact on, which will be good for all of us.
Great. So anyone else? So gentleman in the corner. Yeah.
We've heard a lot about cell therapy, antibodies, gene therapy, immunotherapy. Is there any room for a small startup company with a small chemical molecule?
Oh, of course there is. Of course there is. I mean, you're speaking to somebody who ran a small molecule company, and there was a gentleman on the board called Simon Campbell. I don't know if you know Simon. He was one of the inventors of Viagra and ran Pfizer's operations. So, no. These are all. There's an armamentarium approach. So I think small molecules will absolutely have a place, no question. And particularly given ease, systemic delivery is fantastically important. So no, I think they'll be part of the skill sets, and we're seeing it in some of the oncology treatments. I think oncology will be a combinatorial approach, and you'll have a small molecule approach. You'll probably have an antibody approach, a cell therapy, and these patients will, and that will change during the development of the treatment, right? So. I think they'll each have, you'll also have chemotherapy, have radiotherapy, and we will be. It's a very interesting world. The logistics of it are pretty interesting, but you can envisage that in 10, 15 years' time we'll have a global registry of all cancers, and they'll diagnose the tumour of the cancer, and they'll look on the database. Oh, Mrs. Jones in Cleethorpes had this cancer, and we gave her this, and this, and then it mutated into X, Y, and Z, and we had to give her something else. So I think small molecules are absolutely still a key part of the industry, no question about that.
Lady at the front here.
I was wondering if you can comment on the trends in the life sciences VC business, so the VC as a business.
Yep.
In the US, you have lots of new VCs who raise lots of cash, but they raise one fund and they don't succeed and they burn, or the partnership fractures and the portfolios gets dispersed.
Yep.
We also have big players like NEA and smaller players like Benchmark who prefer to have smaller funds because they think that's the best return model. And I think quite respectively in the UK, Abingworth and SV have been long-time VCs where the partners have stuck together and grown the portfolio over time. Yeah. And then Flagship and others tend to sort of start companies and incubate. What kind of things do you see in the VC business for the life sciences going into 2019?
Yeah,
what do you want Abingworth to become?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It could be a very long answer, but
you can always continue it over drinks.
I think we can certainly do that. But I think the simple answer is there is a lot of capital coming in. There's a lot of smart people who want to be in venture. I think the sustainability piece. How do you build and sustain a business? Most people in the venture world, we don't have junior associates. So all of my partners, I've got 9 investing partners, about 30 people in the firm. They've all come in their kind of 40s. So one of the challenges, and we've been around 45 years, so one of the challenges is the whole succession management. Culture is incredibly important in any partnership. So I think those things are really important. High quality science, I think, and particularly as we're going earlier, having really strong scientific advisors within the team and around us. And I think it's reputation, to be honest with you. I think we see 1,000 deals a year. We invest in probably 3 or 4, and most of that 3 and 4 are from friends of the family, scientists we know, people who want to work with us, or other venture groups who want to work with us. We've got a very broad model geographically and stage, and that I think really plays to our strengths and the industry's strengths as well. And Europe actually on a relative basis is a fantastic place at the moment. The valuations aren't too high, the science is really brilliant, is excellent. One of the big challenges is getting good entrepreneurs. We're still, UK is pretty good, some other parts of Europe are not quite as strong, so that's probably the limiting factor. So I think in terms of what we're doing to answer that specifically, being very cautious on valuations. To pay $150 million pre-money for a small molecule that they haven't even selected the lead compound makes me a little bit nervous. Now they may get away with that because the markets are great and hot and public markets are brilliant, but that feels exuberance gone a little bit mad. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavour.
Gentleman at the back.
You mentioned Solexa before.
Yes.
I'm quite curious. What do you think would have happened if Solexa said no to Illumina?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, Illumina's now worth over $40 billion. and most of that is Celexa. They will point at other different things. And you know, we were involved very early on. We actually merged the company with a company called Lynx on the West Coast. So one of the answers to that is actually even before that piece. It's about what the UK is good at. And I think Oxford Nanopore is a brilliant company with great science. It's what I call the reduction to practice challenge. The Americans are very, very good at that. So that was literally developing and refining the science. So one answer to that. Lynx was also public as well. I think they would probably not have grown as quickly as they have done. And the real challenge, a little bit like Oxford Nanopore, who I'm a great fan of, getting access to the kind of capital they need to build the business. So yeah, it could have been a unicorn in a different environment. You know, we do have 10-year funds, but we'll keep sitting in with companies. I think if the public markets had been better, that would have been an obvious company for us to take public. But the ability to take companies public, it's not even about valuation, it's simply about raising the amount of capital you need, is still pretty tough. So it's a missed opportunity at some level. I think if, but you know, we simply couldn't build the model quickly enough. And I think Illumina's done a fantastic job to execute on it. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Okay. I think maybe one more, and then we'll head off the drinks. Lady at the back.
You mentioned that you just came from China, and the 30% of venture money are going into UK. How many of the Chinese money are going now into UK ventures, and what is the dynamic going to be?
Yeah, I should have been a bit more precise. What we are seeing is Chinese money coming into companies, both European and US, for access to rights. They're starting to come into venture, but I'm not sure any of the UK groups yet have raised venture money. We are in discussions with some groups, and I think they're certainly, and they're doing some things in the US. There are a number of companies that have taken, in the US, that have taken Chinese money. And I think, you know, at some levels that's great. They're also looking to learn and replicate the industry, so I think part of it is that they want to understand how they can compete directly. So we're certainly starting to see, I think, more will come. Look, I think it's money that used effectively can help us build industries. I think you know, they will be a competitor in all areas eventually, and you know, I think we've got to view it as that, and good competitors. The science will eventually get there too. So I think they will become an integrated part of the overall biotech ecosystem, which I think is a good thing.
Okay, go on. One last one. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
What is your view on the investments into human microbiome space?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the microbiome is fascinating, and will play a role in all kinds of ways, both in treatments, in affecting disease. CRISPR will probably play a role in it as well, by the way. Also in the area of wellness too. I think we've not invested in a microbiome company. We've looked at many, and I think our concern is it's a little bit early in terms of really figuring out you know, what the individual elements work. There are some, you know, there's some super companies. Biotechnology in Cambridge is really interesting, and I think they've got quite a, as a leader, that's really quite a smart place to start. But I think really unraveling the bugs and figuring out what they do individually and collectively, there are some interesting indications. So in terms of a future opportunity, if we've been, you know, in terms of looking forward, that would be one of my looking forward opportunities, because again, I think it's very broad. We probably underestimate the impact of the microbiome on all kinds of, you know, diseases directly, but the effect it has on, you know, drugs, pharmacokinetics of drugs, PD of drugs, and clearly plays a fundamental disease role. You know, even in CNS diseases. So there's some very tantalizing but early data suggesting that the microbiome may have an important mediating role to health and wellness.